Pleased to meet you, by the way.
Yeah, likewise.
I assume this runs for an hour.
Yep.
Okay.
And I think we're live. So
Okay.
welcome to the uh, American Prospect Weekly Roundup. We have it every week, Friday at 12:30 p.m. Um, this show where David is out, he's at a conference, and so I'm kind of holding the fort, and I'm welcoming Samantha Hancox-Li, who's an editor at Liberal Currents. Thanks for coming on the show.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me.
Um, so I thought we would chat first a little bit about, the markets. We all know them, we all love them. As a sort of elder millennial who was badly scarred by that financial crisis, I have consistently refused to invest anything in the stock market, foregoing thousands and thousands of dollars in 401k contributions. That's probably stupid on my part, but now I feel pretty good about it. But yeah, a few details. So obviously, Trump did his quote unquote pause of his quote unquote reciprocal tariffs on the entire planet. What he really did was he's now up to 145%, last I checked, on China, 10% on everywhere else, 25% on Canada and Mexico, maybe. Not 100% sure if they've even clarified that yet. 25% on automobiles. And there may be more coming on lumber from Canada and pharmaceuticals, and God knows what else. You can't predict anything from what Trump's going to do from day to day. Um, the stock market is down so far about 15% from its high in December and January. Um, that's not a huge crisis yet. It seems, when the pause, quote unquote, happened, which by the way, left the net tariff position higher than it was before because there's so much trade with China, or at least there used to be. Um, but the stock market popped hugely on that day, on Wednesday, I believe. But now it's back down again. We're seeing, I think, a little bit more sinisterly, the interest rate on U.S. debt is going up, and yeah, especially the 30-year yield, and the value of the dollar is going down. And normally you would see the opposite of that in a financial crisis because everyone would flee to safety. They would buy up dollars, driving the value up, and they would buy up debt, driving the interest rate down. And that happened even in 2008, which was a financial crisis centered in the United States, but the dollar was thought to be, the safe place for everyone. And that turns out to be maybe kind of unwinding, which could, God knows what could happen with that. Uh, University of Michigan Consumer Sentiment survey came down today, was released today. It's at 50.8, the lowest level it's been in many years, lower than the pandemic or during the financial crisis in 2008 and 9. Inflation expectations in the same survey were up to 6.7%, the highest since 1981. Uh, you know, so we're looking down the barrel of, I would say at this point, very likely a recession, and maybe a financial crisis, and maybe a financial crisis that involves significant de-dollarization as people flee to euros. They're starting to talk about how they could get in Europe basically everyone to finance their rearmament program for them by creating trillions of euros of government debt so that people could have something to buy. Anyway, we're we're in a tight spot. Um, so my first question, to you is, obviously neither of us are, financial experts. We don't have Bloomberg terminals, I assume, open.
Yeah, I don't have a Bloomberg terminal hiding just off screen here. Sorry.
That's some bullshit. This is my presidential platform, a Bloomberg terminal in every house. Um, but
Clearly, it's what we need.
So, like Trump got a lot of support during the election from various sort of MAGA or MAGA curious investors, or it was thought that he would be more friendly to business. The markets rallied hugely after his election. and they only started tanking after he took office and started messing everything up. And so, do you have a theory as to why, the investor class was so deluded about Trump doing exactly what he said he was going to do for the entire campaign?
So I think everybody was deluded, and that's part of the magic of Trump, is that, well, exact, right, that different groups of people are able to project their own preferred ideas onto him almost independently of what he says. Because like you say, he's talked about tariffs pretty consistently on the campaign trail. And the business community assumed, well, he can't possibly mean that. That's just red meat for the rubes. And what he's actually going to do is, deregulate and cut taxes, and that'll be good for us. Um, right. And ordinary voters, listened to Trump. The so-called median voter didn't necessarily vote for Trump because they wanted mass deportations or they wanted him to destroy the American university system or whatever he's doing. They wanted lower prices. Um, right. And they projected that onto him. And now we're seeing that it turns out he really did mean a lot of the things that he said, and he's trying to implement them. And now here we are.
Yeah, and so my next question is, I'm trying to put myself in the space, doing the classic, what if it were Bernie Sanders or Barack Obama doing this? Um, Impossible to say with any certainty, but I think it's a safe bet that if it were President Bernie doing a completely deranged set of tariffs like this, I don't think he actually would have done anything like this, not remotely. I think, he basically agreed with what Biden was doing. But supposing he were in the chair and doing something like this, you would have seen a fanatical mobilization from the investor class. You would have, there would be finance bros, with like bandoliers of ammunition and black market AKs are like charging the White House fence, you know, to get to restore the great American, business. And what do you think this says about the kind of the organization and the power of kind of organized capital writ large, inside the financial markets and out? The fact that they haven't been able to really get Trump to fully reconsider. They got him to pause some of his tariffs, but even 10% is huge. Like that's a massive increase. And before he did his big cardboard cutout thing, that would have been considered like a worst case scenario. So, do you have a theory on that?
So I think there's a couple things going on here. Um, One of which is just, like you say, the investor class is kind of been primed for a very long time to think that their biggest threat is going to come from the left, that it's going to be President Sanders confiscating their wealth, and that's, the fear that keeps them up at night. So they weren't quite primed in the same way, to worry about a Republican president crashing the world economy. Um, I think there's also a deeper story because it's not only the investor class that's kind of failed to rally against Trumpism, right? We've seen all across elite sectors of society, whether that's Republican Party, Democratic Party, media, various kinds of constituencies that don't really seem to be reacting as strongly as you might think, to Trump's assault on their prerogatives. Um, Right. So, for example, Trump threatened a variety of elite law firms, so-called big law firms that are like, these are powerful entities. They've got a lot of experience suing the government. He threatens them and they say, oh, yeah, you're right. We're sorry, Mr. Trump. We're not going to do it again. Um, and I think some of that comes from this kind of a curious narrative about the election, right? That Donald Trump did not win a majority of American voters. He did win a plurality. He won more votes than Kamala Harris. It didn't require any electoral college shenanigans, but it's a fair victory by very slender margin. But I think for a lot of people, especially elites, they kind of looked at Trump and they're like, yeah, this guy's a little kooky, this guy's a little crazy. And so if Americans are voting for him anyways, if we elected him again anyways, that must mean he's got a popular mandate. And, Vox populi, vox Dei. You can't stand against the voice of the people. And so I think a lot of people are just still kind of reluctant to take that stand for those reasons.
Yeah, I want to talk about that a little bit more in a few minutes. But yeah, it does seem that, I mean, you look at Biden, and Biden won a much bigger victory in 2020.
Hmm.
You didn't see this, like
No.
everyone sort of bending over backwards. It's like Trump has the kind of real American, stamp of legitimacy and approval, the heartland voters or something who are tied in, like I mean, basically white rural conservatives who get more America points for some reason. Um, but yeah, it's just like the fact that he didn't have to rely on the goofy electoral college to get him over the line. It was like nobody thought that would happen. I didn't think that would happen, certainly. And now, yeah, it's just like, well, the people voted for so we have to our
Gotta
response.
give them what they want. No, and I
Um,
think you're right that this does tie into a much longer standing, narrative that the GOP has been pushing for, my entire life, that their voters are real Americans and that, Democratic voters aren't real Americans, and that indeed many Democratic voters are actually frauds and don't exist and are illegal immigrants and, all the sort of stolen election mythology that they've built up around Biden's victory.
um, Yeah, I remember, gosh, what was it, 2008, Real Virginians? I forget who said it, but yeah, you're right. This has been a consistent narrative. Some people are somehow more American, which we'll get into it again in a little bit, but it does strike me as somewhat ironic that if you look at like what is the actual history of America, and it's like a big old bubbling mess of immigrants from everywhere, all over the place. Um, and you just had this same dynamic replicated in the 19th century, but instead of, people from Latin America and Asia being the out group, it was like Irish people and Southern Europeans, who are somehow culturally unsuited to uh
Oh yeah, it's fascinating reading the political cartoons of another age. And there's like a stock character that's recognizable as the Irishman, and it's a racist stereotype about like the criminal physiognomy of the Irishman. Right. And there's these great cartoons of like the wave of Italian immigration, and it's like alligators that are also kind of the Pope that are like swimming onto shore because it's this fear of Catholic immigration from Italy. Um, and so I think this gets to how what we're seeing is not necessarily new exactly, but just represents the long, long struggle in America, right? Is this a white man's republic? And there are aspects of our founding that are very much about that, right? I mean, slavery was in the original Constitution. Or is this a plural, diverse, democratic republic? And it's just that one struggle over and over across American history, in my
yes.
opinion, anyways.
Yeah, I think you're correct. We can give that the prospect seal of historical approval. Um, I always like the British socialist Tony Benn, and something he said towards the end of his life. It was something like, you every generation has to fight the same battles again and again and again. You'll never catch a train driven by the right man and reach a destination called justice forever. And yeah, we're right back to it, right back to the civil rights movement, right back to Reconstruction and the redemption in the 19th century. Um, One more question about the economy, however. There's this sort of like ongoing debate about kind of, materialism versus idealism, you might say. So you have like vulgar Marxists on one side who'd say like everything people believe, it just comes, turn crank, pops right out of their economic material circumstances. And then you have like strong Will Stancil thought where like the economy doesn't matter at all to anything. People just kind of like get their ideas from, ideological elites and media and so forth. Um, I think kind of both of those are a little silly, but when you think back to Trump's first term, he did a lot of crazy stuff and it never seemed to dent his approval rating all that much. He was never very popular, but he was never like George W. Bush. If you remember, back in the 2000s, he started out pretty unpopular. 9/11 hits. He goes up to like 90% approval. There's another spike after the Iraq invasion. And then, as the wheels start to fall off the occupation, the Katrina disaster is bungled, and then the economy starts to sputter. He got down to like 27, 25% approval rating. And so, what are your thoughts on whether the crisis will, dent the perception of Trump as being this genius businessman among the, I mean, I guess both the MAGA faithful and the kind of, frankly, uninformed swing voters who provided his margin of victory?
Yeah, so let me turn that around and ask you a question. What would you say was a major policy change made during the first Trump administration?
Well, you had a lot of changes to immigration, but mostly kind of in the uh, what would you like a performative way, like this child separation policy. You had a great big escalation of civilian casualties in the drone war that nobody, not even the quote unquote anti-imperialist left, seemed to notice that much. Um, and then I think the biggest change would have to be during COVID, uh, where you had a pop-up welfare state that was like more generous than anything that's ever existed in American history. uh, that was all written by Democrats, but we were for a while. We had an unemployment system that was like way more generous to low income people than even the Nordic countries, which is frankly crazy to think about. Think about passing something that could give people more money if they lose their job. Like that gives Republicans conniption fits today. It gave them conniption fits at the time. So maybe I'm
Yeah, so I
like,
think it's very striking what you just named there, right? Because there's the various kinds of like immigration stunts that he pulls that are very cruel, right? They hurt people, but they don't really do much to affect the total net flow of immigrants to the United States. People keep on coming. Right. He changes the drone war, the rules of engagement for the drone war. Okay, there's a few thousand more civilian casualties overseas. Again, that's horrible for the people who are, killed by drones, but it's not something that's, reorganizing the domestic economy, the domestic society of the United States. And then we have COVID. And there's no and there's a reason for this, right? It's because Trump's major policy initiatives were continually stymied in the first Trump administration, right? That they could not even repeal Obamacare. That used to be, right, a huge plank was, elect Republicans and we'll repeal Obamacare. And then they didn't. And Trump doesn't really pass very much through Congress, and a lot of his stuff gets tied up in all these court battles. And he appoints some judges that are very consequential, but that's kind of slow moving. And so when he comes into office this time around, he kind of recognizes that, or he believes that he was stymied, he would say, by the deep state. And so this time around, his plan, as we're all clearly seeing, is that he's going to get around it, right? He's going to unleash Elon Musk and Doge to do probably unconstitutional things to just close government departments, right? He is going to just ignore Congress and abuse discretionary powers to set tariffs. And so he's really pushing through major policy changes that he was never able to push through in the first term. And so I think, we're probably going to see bigger movement on his approval for that reason, because he is making more changes than he was able to the first time around.
yeah, I should mention, I forgot to bring up the big tax cuts. In his first term, the only big piece of legislation he got through is a big tax cut for the rich. And if I recall correctly, that was his lowest point of approval during his first administration, but did have the knock-on effect of somewhat juicing the economy in a very inefficient manner because most of the money goes to people who don't spend it, namely rich people. But did probably bring the unemployment rate down a little bit and create the kind of like Goldilocks economy of 2019 that people seem to like so much. Um,
Hmm.
Yeah, I think it yeah, you can definitely get, the like the media never really communicated the stakes of what Trump was doing, like when he was extorting Zelensky and whatnot and getting impeached but not convicted. All this like the Russia story that was all just kind of treated as a kind of like sideshow distraction. But a genuine economic crisis, that seems to me like the one time when the media will actually communicate what Trump is doing in a clear manner, because it's just like it's for, I don't know, various sort of sociological reasons, having to do with how journalism works in this country. Like you can actually say what he's doing and it doesn't appear partisan because no, look, numbers, there's numbers, here's chart line go down. Um, and of course, the owners of the media are also very wealthy for the most part. Uh,
Yeah. Um, I mean, I think you can be pretty cynical about that. I think it's also just, unfortunate but true that the average American is not, they do not see an immediate impact in their life depending on what's happening in Ukraine. Unless they're Ukrainian, they have family back there. Again, there's always somebody who's impacted, but most Americans are not seeing an impact on their lives right now based on the war in Ukraine. A recession would very rapidly impact all Americans in their own personal lives and people they know in ways that are basically undeniable. And you're right that it'll be much easier for the media to tell a story about that. And so that's kind of where I fall on this, Marxism versus Stancilism question. Yeah, two great names to put right next to each other. Um, that, the kind of vulgar Marxist story that, narrative doesn't matter. I think that's BS. I think that's very demonstrably BS. I think the so-called strong stantialism that reality doesn't matter and it's all narrative. I don't think that's accurate either. I think it is easier to tell a narrative when that narrative has something to latch onto and something that connects with people.
yeah. Yeah, and I think if there's one thing you can take out of the overwhelming reaction against the, frankly, fairly moderate inflation during the Biden presidency is that Americans hate it when their like consumer goods are more expensive, or they can't get access to them. That would be even worse.
Hmm.
Nation of treats lovers. It's kind of the, I think we might have been chatting about this on Blue Sky, but it's like the social contract in this country. You don't get a welfare state, you don't get a union job for the most part, you don't get meaningful representation in Congress. Nothing ever happens. But you do get a cornucopia of cheap imported stuff from Malaysia and Vietnam and China and Thailand and Mexico. And, even with a fairly meager salary, you can afford a lot of consumer comforts. Um,
Yeah, no, I think that's exactly right. There's one of these graphs that I really love. I'm a graph lover. That just kind of tracks the change in the real price or the real cost of various kinds of goods, not inflation generally, but the change in real price of consumer goods like televisions, like cars, like clothing, like food, and the price of what you might call the essentials of security in the modern world, like housing, like healthcare, like education, like a retirement. Um, and the consumer goods, the price is all going down over time, and the essentials of life is going up and up and up and up. Right. And so, there are these incredible images you'll see, right, of a homeless person with a flat screen TV in their tent, right? And
yeah,
to some people think that's ridiculous, but it's like, no, that's actually totally normal. The TV's cheap. It's the
yeah,
apartment that's expensive,
yep.
right? That's the society that we live in. And I think that social contract is breaking down in all kinds of ways as we look around us.
Yeah, you could imagine a trade where it's like, okay, your imports, your TV is going to be more expensive, but you'll get, Medicare for all or free education or something like that. But instead, it's just negative sum. We're taking away your treats and we're not giving you anything. It's just,
No, no, I think that's right. And I think, just to kind of step back for a minute and talk about what's going on with tariffs, um, is I see Trump and the current Trump regime as a kind of an authoritarian personalist regime. And the thing about personalist regimes is that they're always kind of chaotic. They're always you know, characterized by many different factions in the court that are all competing with each other to implement policy, right? They're not working together to implement policy, but they're like the internal court politics is about different people fighting each other. And the only way to ever resolve those questions is to bring it back to the king, right? Whose personal choice, whose personal whim can settle disputes. And so what we're seeing right now with tariffs is Trump says, I want tariffs, and he's tweeting out stuff about tariffs or truthing out stuff about tariffs on Truth Social. And they appear to have generated an initial set of tariffs through using ChatGPT, which is why the numbers were all so strange. Um, and on top of this, you have different groups inside the administration who are essentially like wish casting their own ideas onto the tariffs, right? So you'll have people who will talk about, oh, we're going to reindustrialize America through tariffs. And you have other groups that say, oh, we're going to fight China through tariffs. And you have another group entirely that says, well, we are going to make you manly again through tariffs. Um, that's its own ball of wax right there. But none of these people are actually driving the bus, right? They're just trying to make stuff up. There isn't necessarily a coherent policy behind any of this, right? There's not we shouldn't expect this to reindustrialize America, right? We shouldn't expect this to like cut China out of world trade. Um, well, I mean, we'll see how that one goes. Uh, and it's purely destructive because, the Mad King appears to have some pretty delusional beliefs about how tariffs work, right? He thinks that tariffs are money that other countries pay to us rather than a transfer of money from one group of Americans to another, right? He seems to think that trade surpluses are somehow us getting ripped off by other countries because they export stuff to us, right? These are not really connected to reality, but that's who's running the show.
Yeah, I guess the real profound irony of this is that, Biden was inaugurating a renaissance of manufacturing, uh,
Yes.
and which included some tariffs, which he had kind of borrowed from Trump's first term that were relatively small, with a few exceptions, like Chinese EVs got a massive, like 100% tariff because they would wipe out the U.S. auto industry if we let them in. Kind of a understandable if unfortunate outcome. But it was part of a plan, as you said. There was a coherent goal with like a big staff of experts and a bureaucracy that they were all pulling in the same direction. They had all the papers worked out, and then there were some difficulties with implementation and so on, but it was working. Like inflation adjusted manufacturing investment more than doubled under Biden. Line go up, and now line
Yeah,
go
line went way
down.
up.
He's going to destroy all of that because it's such a, like to just on the point of like these is going to reindustrialize the country. We're going to bring back manufacturing. Like, well, in order to do that, you need certainty around these tariffs. You need to know what they're going to be for a long time. It takes like 2, 3, 4 years to build a factory, especially one of these advanced facilities like a semiconductor fab, and then another probably 10, 15 years maybe to pay it off by selling the products that it produces. And now we're moving the tariffs around willy-nilly with no warning, on a daily basis almost. So it's just preposterous. Anybody with any kind of investment, plan is going to be pulling back because it's so radically crazy, that you don't know what's going to be tomorrow. And so it's going to have the exact opposite effect. We're going to even further deindustrialize the country.
No, I think that's exactly right. I mean, the an advanced semiconductor manufacturing facility, a fab, costs a billion, multiple billions of dollars, right? And that's an investment that pays out, like you said, over a period of years. And if you're sitting on $1 billion and you're trying to decide, do I build a factory in America? And you can't tell, is this a good idea or am I about to set $1 billion on fire? Like, what do you do? Well, you don't invest, right? That's pretty straightforward. Um, Right, and I think you're right to emphasize that Biden was pursuing industrial policy and it was working. This is something I talked about with Maya Mindell on the Neoliberalism podcast a few weeks ago. That a lot of different countries at different times have tried industrial policy for whatever kind of national policy reason you might have. You want to have this kind of industry or that kind of industry in your country. But there's not like there's a big red button that just makes industries appear, right? Getting this to work is a complicated question of economic policy. And so it really matters that the people executing it are competent, right, to adapt to a changing and a difficult economic landscape, to understand what levers of power they actually have. And if you pull them, will it actually deliver what you want? Um, and Biden seems to be relatively competent at doing that in terms of chips manufacturing, in terms of battery manufacturing, in terms of other forms of green energy. Uh, I would not characterize the current Trump administration as competent.
Yeah. Yeah, and it wasn't just tariffs, by the way. There were a ton of subsidies in the
Yes,
Inflation Reduction Act and the CHIPS Act. That was a bipartisan bill too. The
yes,
infrastructure law, and so it was a kind of a carrot and a stick approach. That wasn't the because you wouldn't want to completely like choke off trade between the world's two largest economies overnight. That'd be crazy.
that would be crazy.
Uh, so maybe we could turn to back to, what you were talking about before, the kind of crisis of capitulation. You mentioned the big law firms, Paul Weiss, sort of bending over backwards to ingratiate themselves to Trump. Um, we had, Colombia, which was, threatened with a freeze of like what, $400 million in grants or something like that, and sort of just rolled over immediately. Harvard did more or less the same thing. Princeton did not, as I understand it. So it's not a universal like approach necessarily, but you've seen all of these just like mega powerful, mega wealthy institutions. I mean, I don't know how big the Columbia Endowment is, but I think it's pretty big.
That's not
Um,
small.
yeah, it's a lot bigger than your average state school. And so. What do you suppose, this lack of fight, um, where is it coming from, and why can't, like, for instance, at Columbia, they rolled over and they didn't even get anything for it, which I could have told them was going to happen. And so there's this, I'm thinking of like Lord of the Rings when Aragorn tells King Theoden, is Theoden says, "I'll not risk open war," and Aragorn says, "Open war is upon you, whether you would risk it or not." And they're just not, they're incapable of seeing the second thing, that there's no option, if you want to preserve anything like the institution as it previously existed, to standing up to this guy. And yet no spines in evidence, for the most part.
No, I mean, I think that is a very apt and unsettling metaphor. I mean, I think of it in terms of, the high school I went to. Bullies prey on the weak.
Yeah.
Bullies prey on the weak. If you give in to the bully, he will come back tomorrow and bully you again, right? If you stand up to him, if you punch him in the mouth, he'll say, I don't want any of that smoke, and he will leave, right? That's just how these people operate. And Trump is a bully, right? That's kind of the basis of his personality is he is a bully. JD Vance is a bully. Excuse me. But so I think that's just my advice to anyone who's listening is if you stand up to these people, you will have a better chance of coming away with both your honor and your security intact. Because if you cave, they will just come back for more. But in terms of why are people caving? I mean, I've talked a little bit about this on Blue Sky. It kind of reflects, I mean, to put it in somewhat airy terms, a kind of a crisis of faith in liberal principles. This sense that so many of our mainstream institutions thought of themselves as liberal by default, right? They put a big poster on the wall that says, we believe, in free speech and free association and democracy, but they didn't think they'd ever actually have to fight for it, right? They thought all those questions were settled, maybe in 1989 or 1991, and they didn't have to defend them anymore, right? And so they were free to, just kind of ignore them or kind of think, well, maybe, their critics on the right or on the left have a point and we can, hear them out more and more. And now we're in that moment when those fundamental American principles of freedom of speech, freedom of association, freedom of the press, the right to vote, democracy, when these are very much on the line, and you have people who thought they would never have to fight for them, and they're not.
Yeah. Yeah, kind of a bunch of freeloaders and cowards, who thought they could just sort of sit rich, fat, and happy at the top of, peak institutions and not have to get in a gutter fight with the unhinged fascist madman. Um, yeah, it strikes me that I've written about this a little bit before, but it's kind of nobody believes in America, like across the entire political spectrum. You have very few of the sort of traditional American civic religion, the faith, as you say. Um, on the far right, of course, it's the Republican Party. They hate America. They want to destroy democracy, destroy freedom, all the principles, flawed as they were when they were set up, but improved over time. They want all that to go. They hate, cosmopolitan values, immigrants, and everything else that's good about this country. They want it something more like the Confederate, kind of empire. Um,
I mean, they'll say it, right? I mean, if you read what the Claremont Institute publishes, they're one of these little party organs of fascism in America. They're starting to say, well, look, the Constitution doesn't agree with us, so we have to abandon the Constitution because there's a deeper law. And the deeper law, obviously, is that this is a white man's republic, right? And that's the fundamental principle of the Republican Party, is that we would have to destroy the Constitution to maintain the supremacy of white men in America. Right. It sounds
yeah.
whatever. I know I sound like a, hair on fire leftist when I say that, but they themselves will say it now. So
It's
I
what
think it's
they're
time
doing.
we face up to what they're trying to do here.
Yeah. Yeah, you have Elon Musk and Donald Trump basically abrogating Article 1 of the Constitution that Congress gets to decide how money is spent. They're just staking that power.
Yes,
Uh,
there's the power of the purse. There's the appointments clause, right? That Elon Musk very obviously holds a high office in the American government. And everyone in the government is pretending, well, if we don't actually say he's holding high office, then he's not really in high. But obviously, holds high office and he's directing the operations of Doge, and that's a straightforward violation of the appointments clause as well, right? And I think, this just gets back to what you're saying is that they do not believe in America. They do not believe in the Constitution. And I think we, as liberals, as progressives, we need to reclaim that, right? I think that's a powerful narrative that we are defending the flag, that we are defending the Constitution, that we are defending America against people who want to steal it from us.
yeah. Yeah, I mean to sort of finish up the little spectrum there, like on the left, I wouldn't say it's like uncomplicatedly anti-American, but there's a deep strain of reflexive criticism of America, especially in foreign policy. I think you see this in how
Oh,
many leftists got totally twisted around the axle about Ukraine, which is a
yes.
very straightforward thing that was happening if you could get your head out of the reflexive, anti-America, anti-NATO bucket, where Noam Chomsky lives. But in the center, like, because the left basically has no power, very little power, so some cultural influence, but it's not a vast organized institution with thousands of elected officials. I think what's more interesting and telling is a sort of like center left, um, the broad kind of Democratic Party mainstream. And there you just see this sort of enervating helplessness. And I think the example of that is Merrick Garland, the man who could have stopped all of this by himself, a guy who waited 18 months to even appoint a special counsel to prosecute Trump for trying to overthrow the government. Like this was the worst crime under a constitutional republic that you could imagine. You know, he tried to destroy the Constitution and overturn an election. And these clowns sat around twiddling their thumbs, hoping they could give him the good old boy, you know, sort of gentleman's get out of jail free card. And only when he forced them to do it, uh, did the or rather the January 6th committee kind of forced his hand by making him look like a feckless incompetent that he finally got the wheels turning. And by that point, as we since learned, it was too late. You know, the Supreme Court bailed him out. And you could sort of try to imagine what would have happened if he had started immediately. But I think back when the iron was still hot and he had arrested Trump on day one of the Biden administration, or when he was officially confirmed by the Senate a couple of months later, we'd be in a very different position. It took some time for the Republican Party to sort of coalesce again behind Trump and convince themselves that January 6th was either fake or good or both at the same time somehow. Um, and yeah, I don't know. Do you have any thoughts, or like how the just this incredible weenie energy that emanates from the people who are supposed, charged with defending the republic from all enemies, foreign and domestic? That's the damn oath of office.
That is the oath of office. So I like history. I like reading history because I think it lets us get out of the very narrow focus of social media and horse race coverage and puts things in a larger perspective. So there's a book that I read recently called The Rules of the Game, I believe by Andrew Gordon. I can double check that later. And it is about the Battle of Jutland in World War One. And it is about more deeply the culture of the Royal Navy leading up to World War One. And Gordon, I think it's Gordon. Gordon's argument is that after the Battle of Trafalgar, the Royal Navy never fought a real war for 100 years, and that they had Britannia rules the waves, totally unquestioned naval supremacy. And in the long, calm lee of Trafalgar, the institution went to seed. That in a whole generation after generation, sorry, that Nelson's generation, right? The generation of officers that won Trafalgar had spent most of their lives at war, and they were very good at it, and they were very aggressive, and they would, engage the enemy more closely, um, and that was their business. But in the long calm lee of Trafalgar, generation after generation of officers comes up whose lives are about following rules, about polishing the decks rather than winning battles. Right. And this creates just a total culture of obedience and process and an obsession with, again, with following the exact procedure um, that leads them to fail to take the initiative, to use their own judgment, and to close with and destroy the enemy when he is in front of you. And I think obviously, there are important disanalogies here. But I think we have a generation of Democratic politicians who don't have that drive, who do not have that initiative to go out and do things and make things happen, right? And they are so consumed by the norms and the procedures and well, we shouldn't prosecute former presidents because, like, that's just not done. And I think that's led us to disaster. Right? I think like, when you look at the world today, why are people so attracted to politicians like AOC? Because AOC is a fighter, right? Because AOC will get out there and do something, right? She will fight for something in a way that it seems like so many others have just surrendered their moral judgment, right? Recently, Kirsten Gillibrand, right? When asked about Andrew Cuomo, a man who sexually assaulted many different people over the years, a man who is responsible for the deaths of thousands of New Yorkers during COVID. And she's asked about Cuomo, and she says, well, I can't say anything about that, right? That's up to the voters to decide. And that's just a total abdication of your own courage, right? Your own judgment to go out and say, what do you believe? We're going to do it. Right. And I think this kind of fecklessness is not going to serve us well.
Yeah. Yeah, I think I think you're absolutely right about that. But I think there's also, there's an aspect to this which is all about, sort of bipartisan bona fides and proving one's sort of, uh, you know, r- improving your reputation as someone with like quote unquote spotless integrity. Because, I'm thinking of the documents case when Trump illegally took a whole bunch of government records and was keeping them in his bathroom at Mar-a-Lago. And I think that it took like 6 months for and multiple, they were like negotiating with him, basically saying in so many words that just give them back and we'll let you off the hook. And it was 6 months before they filed charges in that or something like that, many months. Then it turned out that Biden had done the same thing technically, but inadvertently, that very easy to do when you don't realize how many things are classified or whatever. Like that whole classification machine is a very complicated and difficult to obey with. And as soon as he found those, Biden was like, "Oh, okay, we got to send somebody in there and we'll figure out what I have and what I don't." It took 2 weeks for Garland to appoint someone to investigate that. And it shows you, that in facing a real challenge, it was like, oh God, can I possibly avoid this in any way? Just if I'd squirm around and try to appease the bully, But when it came to like demonstrating, ooh, yeah, I'm going to take on my own side and make me look really, and straight laced and independent, then it was like, suddenly I spring into action. Um, but it's kind of, I mean, just like you were saying, it's cowardice basically. It's an unwillingness to like attack the enemy because I don't want to do that and might get shot. It's dangerous. um
Again, a little bit of military history that I quite like. There's a story from the memoirs of U.S. Grant. Uh, when it was very, very early commands, no one's ever heard of it. Um, when, he's first fighting in the Civil War, and he says, well, I had heard reports that there was a Confederate detachment camped by this little stream. And I took my, regiment or whatever it was, and we approached them and we were creeping up this hill towards, and we knew like the camp was on the other side of the hill. And he said, I was so scared. I was scared beyond what I can explain. And I just did not have the moral courage to tell my soldiers to turn around. All right, they were all looking at me, and I couldn't do it. And we got to the top of the hill, and we looked down, and there was no one there. The Confederates had all left, right? Because they knew we were coming, and they were terrified of us as we were of them. And he said, and that was an instructive lesson, right? That you can never be so afraid of what the enemy is going to do to you that you refuse to make them afraid of what you are going to do to them, right? And I think a lot of liberals have gotten themselves into this defensive crouch where it's like, well, we can't do that because then the Republicans will. And it's like, this kind of thinking is just paralysis, right? It is a kind of an internal thought paralysis that prevents you from ever doing anything because whatever you do, someone might respond to it, right? Well, after a certain point, you just have to accept that risk, right? You have to accept that in this big game for the future of the American Republic, you will have to run some risks. You will have to make some tough calls, and you cannot let fear rule your actions.
Yeah, it strikes me that this may tie in a little bit to American exceptionalism, this idea that America is kind of God's chosen nation, the best country on earth, and there's a very different reaction to a very similar effort from the president of South Korea when he attempted to declare martial law. And you had, the parliament basically stormed the gates of the parliament building to get back in session and declare what he had done, unconstitutional. And eventually he was arrested. But there are videos of like a guy, like 60-year-old member of parliament, live streaming
Yeah,
himself.
the leader of the opposition. I guess I no, well, he's the leader of the opposition party, but I think it is important that, if I understand correctly, that they had a divided government,
Yeah.
that the opposition actually did have a majority or at least a plurality in the legislature, which is not the situation we find ourselves in today. Um, Yoon's coup was also like kind of clownishly incompetent. in certain ways, like almost bizarrely so. That's something we can talk about. But you're right that we have not seen that level of mass demonstration, that level of mass mobilization against Trump. That's unfortunate. But, as liberals, as progressives, it's our job to get there, right? It's our job to lead, and to try to work towards ousting these people in 2026 and 2028.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, South Korea is a place that within living memory, not that long ago, was a dictatorship. And
Yes.
I think that tends to indicate y- people who have had to fight for democratic institutions recognize what how valuable they are, even if they're flawed. They're always flawed everywhere. There's no perfect place. Um, but also how necessary it is to mobilize in their defense. It doesn't happen automatically, and I think that's kind of the trap that a lot of people have been stuck in, thinking about American exceptionalism, world's oldest democracy. It's like not even true. We haven't had democracy in, like the South has been a democracy since the mid 60s, maybe the early 70s, after the civil rights movement. Um, but yeah, we're not God's chosen nation or anything. I mean, we kind of suck compared to other countries and our institutions and our welfare state and all that. But you know, this kind of thing could always crop up in any democracy where there's an organized bunch of, extremists who want to overthrow the government and get rid of democracy. And you always have to be on your guard. There's no magic cultural thing that will protect you. It's always a possibility. And
Yeah, I mean, I mean, some of it is that old American civic religion. A lot of it I do believe in, right? I think there is a beautiful dream here and a dream that is worth fighting for. But like the civil rights movement did before us, you have to fight for it. And I think the civil rights movement is actually quite instructive. Right? I've written about this a little bit at Liberal Currents, um, but it's kind of retconned in the national imagination that the civil rights movement was kind of a spontaneous mass uprising against Jim Crow. And that's not true. The civil rights movement was not spontaneous, and it was not mass in the way that we understand a mass protest today, right? That, for example, excuse me, the lunch counter sit-ins, for example, were only a few hundred people, right? And they were very carefully planned and prepared for in advance. The freedom rides, again, a few hundred or a few thousand people, and again, carefully planned about who's going to ride, how are we training them to ride, what are we trying to do here? The Freedom Summer in Mississippi, again, a relatively small group of people. There's not millions of people turning out all across the nation all at once because they saw something on social media. But the civil rights movement was able to win anyways, right? Because it's not necessarily about starting with a spontaneous mass protest, but it is about having that kind of moral clarity, that kind of commitment to the long haul and to fighting in tactical ways that push our kind of narrative forwards and advance that dream of, you know, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness.
yeah, there's a book, I think you maybe mentioned it in your article by Thomas Ricks. Uh,
It's very good.
it's called Waging a Good War, a military history of the civil rights movement. And he basically takes a sort of military reporting, military, strategy and tactics lens to look at the civil rights movement, how it was organized, and how it was quite similar to a military campaign in many ways. Um,
No, I strongly recommend anybody listening to this pick up Thomas Ricks's Waging a Good War. It is very revealing about how the civil rights movement actually functioned and what we can do to emulate that today.
yeah. We got a comment from John Darger on YouTube. In Madison, back when Wisconsin was going to take away public union rights, a lot of
Sorry,
the
we're also being joined by my cat now, so.
quite all right. A lot of the professors didn't show up. Our elite schools have great individuals, but even there isn't solidarity. Yeah, I'm cordially a little skeptical of the academy as a site of resistance. I mean, it's something you could try, but the structure of it is kind of unfortunate. for any kind of egalitarian politics. It's hyper abstract, highly hierarchical, and not a great. It's not like a labor union that necessarily produces solidarity within its membership. Um, Still something to focus on, but yeah, let's see. We got about 5 minutes left. Any final comments on how to take back the country from the neo-Confederates who want to get rid of government of the people, by the people, for the people.
Yeah, I mean, as you know, I've written about this at Liberal Currents. There's an essay, Roadmap to American Reconstruction, that talks about how we kind of need to start by recognizing that we are in a bad situation, that we lost pretty bad. Like the best time to stop this from happening was last November, and we lost that battle, and now we are in a different situation, right? That we need to be thinking. We don't need to start from the assumption that like, well, obviously the American people are just waiting to rise up and throw the bums out. That's not going to happen. We need to work towards that. And we need to work towards that outcome by generating the right kinds of confrontations with the administration that highlight their cruelty and their lawlessness and their corruption, and highlight the ways that we are standing up for the basic principles of America, for freedom and for humanity. Um, and I think we also need to offer the American people something better, right? I think people are frustrated with the way things are going in this country in a lot of ways, right? That's why Harris lost, is that people were frustrated with the Biden administration for various kinds of reasons. And I think Trump is highlighting the ways in which the American system of government is dangerously unbalanced. The ways that Congress has kind of completely abdicated its own power in our constitutional arrangement, and we functionally have a government at this point that is run by a president and by a Supreme Court, and a big gap in the middle where Congress is supposed to be. So I think we need to have a plan, a program to offer people to put this economy back together in a way that's going to work for everyone, to put our government back together in a way that will work for everyone. Um, and I think generating those kinds of proposals is one of the big works for liberal intellectuals like you and me and various other kinds of people in the coming years.
Yeah, well, it's straightforward. Good. Get your pamphlets here, folks. No,
We do our best.
let's see. So, where can people find you? Liberalcurrents.com, I assume, and you guys have a podcast over there, I believe.
Yes. So, yeah, I am an editor at liberalcurrents.com. I also write for liberalcurrents.com. I host one of our podcasts, Neon Liberalism, which you can get wherever podcasts are sold. You can find me on Blue Sky as SJS Hancox-Li .liberalcurrents.com. I think that about covers it.
Great. Well, you can always find great stuff at the American Prospect, prospect.org. And that about wraps it up for us. We will be back next week. I think David will be here, but I guess we'll see. We'll have to check in with him for our next weekly roundup. But anyway, that'll do it. Thanks for listening, everybody.